We're sisters, best friends, and authors on a mission to help you stoke your creative fire and live the life of your dreams. We believe that purpose fuels passion and that creativity is your secret weapon for mass construction. There's never been a better time to bless the world with your dream realized. You're listening to The Kate and Abbie Show.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Kate and Abbie Show. Today, we're diving into a story mining episode. We haven't done one of those in a while, so we figured it was about time. And the topic we're going to break open is something Abbie and I have spent some time chatting about over the past couple weeks. Analyzing some of our favorite stories and also some stories that didn't capture our attention as much, and analyzing, what was it about that worked and that didn't on this topic, which is action sequences in movies, and what makes action meaningful and engaging versus low stakes and boring. Because let's face it, it can be one or the other. If you have an action sequence in your story, whether it's a screenplay, a novel, a play, whatever it is, it can either be extremely engaging. You're on the edge of your seat waiting to see what will happen to these characters and how this battle or argument or fist fight will play out. Or you might be sitting back wanting to skip forward 10 seconds or skim through the page because you feel like it's so low stakes, there's no suspense, and you already know what's going to happen. So what makes it one or the other? How can we make an action sequence high stakes and super engaging? So we're going to dive into that and give you some really great examples. So if you're listening on another platform, be sure to check out the video version of this podcast to be able to actually see clips from the films that we're going to be using as examples. So that's what we're diving into today. But before we get started,
we first have to thank our sponsors, who are you guys. You're the ones who support this show and keep it going, and we so appreciate your support. So if you get value out of this podcast, go to patreon.com/The Kate and Abbie Show and help us keep this podcast alive and free of interruptions. Okay, let's dive into it. I'm excited to talk about this because this is something you and I talk about a lot.
yes,
A lot, especially after watching a movie or reading. I know you don't read, but I will complain to you about books that I read that are just full of action that's not engaging.
Right.
And whether you're writing, for any storytelling medium, whether it's film or books, anything, a story is a story. And when it comes to action sequences, there are a few things you have to get right in order to really keep your audience turning pages or, glued to the screen, clicking next episode, 5 more minutes, that kind of addictive quality.
Right. Like when someone stays up all night reading a book, it's for a reason. It's not because it's low stakes and it's predictable. It's because you want to know what happens next. It has that addictive quality to it. And I think that an action sequence done right in a book or movie will have that addictive quality. It will have that immersive, meaningful, engaging quality to it.
So what would you say is the number one key ingredient?
You already know. Internal conflict. So I think a lot of writers sometimes overlook the fact that the intensity in the scene, in the action sequence itself, it starts so far before the battle or the fight begins. It starts with the internal conflict of the character.
Yes, because otherwise it's just plot driven. Like literally, and I made a video about this one time about plot driven stories versus character driven stories. But what's happening literally in your brain when you're watching a plot-driven movie, usually with a lot of action sequences in it, is just your mirror neurons are firing in your head, and you are kind of experiencing vicariously the same suspense and stakes that the characters on the screen are experiencing. But if that's it, and it stops there, and you don't even care about them as people, and you don't understand what they're internally struggling with and what they're carrying around and what they believe and what they maybe mistakenly believe is true about the world and about themselves, well, then you're just kind of invested only as far as you can kind of understand what they're going through and what they are experiencing physically, but not emotionally. And so it's that syndrome of like, you know, turning on a movie when you don't even know what's going on and there's like an action scene. Well, okay, so if I watch this, then my mirror neurons are firing as if that's happening to me, but I'm not putting myself into the shoes of the character, really.
Right. And that's what makes it memorable, too.
Right.
Long after the film ends or long after you've finished reading the book and you still think back to that sequence and like, oh my gosh, that was so intense. Now, when it's just something that you're experiencing and you're, like Abbie said, your mirror neurons are firing because you're like, oh, if I experienced, you know, falling off a cliff, you know, that would be scary. That would hurt. You know what I mean? Or if I experienced, you know, breaking my arm, that would hurt. And I can wince and realize like, oh, ow, you know, but I'm not going to remember that. There's nothing memorable about that will stay with me. I'm just reacting kind of inwardly in my mind to what I would do if I was that character.
Right.
Whereas when I can tie into what the character is feeling based on their internal conflict that's been built up since go, that's what makes it memorable. Yeah. Is seeing our favorite characters get broken.
Exactly.
That's what we all love. And we can't experience that until you've established the internal conflict first.
Right.
Before the battle begins. Before the fight begins.
So as we're talking about this, you guys are probably thinking of some examples of stories that do this well and also not well are probably springing to mind right now. I know that I notice it every time because it's like if you're not emotionally invested, it's because the writer didn't take the time to build up who is this character, what do they value, what do they believe, what do they want, what is the point of conflict emotionally before there is conflict externally.
Yes.
You know, and that's the reason why we enjoy watching movies about like historical events too, like that you absolutely know what's going to happen, like Titanic or Pearl Harbor. You immediately know exactly what the events are going to be, like the actual external plot driven stuff, but the thing that makes you care is the characters and what's internally happening with the characters, and that's kind of what brings the personal emotional stakes.
Exactly.
So it doesn't have to do with like, you know, oh, I can't reveal, you know, what might happen physically. It doesn't even matter what happens physically. What matters is who it happens to. That's what we really care about. And so an example that Kate and I were talking about recently that we both watched recently is Captain America Civil War, and how there's a lot of action sequences throughout that film, and a lot of them are well choreographed and well designed, but you don't really feel as intensely about all of the action sequences, in my opinion, as you do for the final battle between Captain America and Iron Man, which is kind of like the whole thing leads up to this crescendo moment. And although there is internal conflict throughout the course of the whole film, that's really the point where I would say the most internal conflict is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we have obviously these two separate conflicts kind of coming together into like this boiling point moment.
Did you know? I didn't know it was him. Shouldn't. I just did you know? Yes.
So we have the story with Steve is protecting Bucky and he cares very deeply for him. So it's like this conflict here. And on the opposite side, we have Tony, who's just learned that his parents were killed by Bucky inadvertently through a sequence of villains and a web of deception and all that stuff, all that Marvel goodness.
This isn't going to change what happened. I don't care. He killed my mom.
But we have two very personal conflicts there.
Exactly.
Right?
And that's what makes it so intense.
It's emotional. It's what
emotional.
It is. And it's outside of just the realm of like, do or die, I'm on this side, you're on that side. That's what made it more emotional, in my opinion, is that it was like, it's a personal, emotional thing for each of them.
Yeah, and you could you could understand the internal conflict of Cap, and you could understand the internal conflict of Tony. And that's what made it that clash be so memorable, and it's actually intense to watch. And that's one thing that, even though Abbie and I enjoy Marvel, and I'm sure many of you do as well, there's a lot of fight sequences, and people sort of, I've seen a lot of articles poking fun of, they're like so low stakes because no one ever gets hurt, hardly ever. No one's gonna die. You know, they're all gonna make it out okay for the most part in like 90% of the movies. So when you add the internal conflict of the characters that's been built over time, and you have these two characters clashing, that automatically makes it higher stakes and more engaging than just here's the hero in combat with a bunch of red shirt guys, we call them, which is kind of for some of you who have watched Star Trek, the original series, you always knew when they get off at a new planet and there's the guy in the red shirt who has no name and you've never seen him before. It's like, that's the character that's going to die, and you don't care that he died because you don't even know who he is. You know what I mean? Yeah, that sounds terrible, but it's like they don't want it to be any of the characters you care about. Right. Again, none of those characters ever get hurt. It's just the red shirt guy. So that's the thing, is they use that because they don't want to spend a lot of time on it. It doesn't matter. So when you have your main characters, you don't want your main characters to feel like, you know, they're just in battle with red shirt guys. You want it to be, no, this is meaningful and I can't wait to see what happens next. Not just like pew pew, smash, CGI. Yeah. And, or if, you know, it's in a book, you know, just nameless villains coming at them out of the ether, that we don't care about these villains. There has to be more than just the hero's internal conflict. There has to be, who are they battling? Why? Why is that meaningful to them? And why is it meaningful to the villain?
Yeah.
And when you have those ingredients together, especially when it's not a villain, and that's one of the things that was great about this conflict in Civil War, was even though there was a villain involved, it wasn't the villain they were battling each other. Two heroes, hero battling hero. That's like, so much good conflict there, and that's what made it stand out and be so iconic.
Right.
When a bunch of other action sequences had followed it, but this one was obviously much higher stakes, much more on the edge of your seat, waiting to see what happens next.
Yeah. For sure. And so that's what you have to take the time to set up. I think when you're planning on writing something that's kind of this climactic confrontation, is take the time, because a lot of times that will be towards the third act of your story anyway, but take the time to really build up what is the emotional core, really, at the heart of all of this. Because it has to be very basic and emotional. That's what makes us care at the end of the day.
Definitely. You're right. It requires setting up. Like, so if you're in the middle of writing a novel, don't wait until that climax at the end, the big battle at the end, to start developing why it's going to matter to the character and to the person or the force or the event or whatever it is that they're battling. We have to understand why that means something to the main character, and that's what's going to have us on the edge of our seats. That's what has us reading till 3 a.m.
Yeah, 100%. Which kind of leads us into our next story example, which is Around the World in 80 Days. And we're drawing this example from the BBC series that recently came out, I think last year, which is such an awesome adaptation of the story. I love it so much. And just the acting, the production design itself is fantastic. But the characters are so on point and so well written. And right from the first episode, basically like the first 10 minutes of the first episode, you learn all three of the main characters' internal conflict. You have Fog.
I'm going to circumnavigate the globe in 80 days.
Passepartout.
I've been sent by the agency, monsieur, your new valet.
And Miss Fix.
Would your readership really suffer a mass coronary if they discovered a woman had written this?
And they're all going on this adventure together, and they all have personal stakes. In fact, I'm going to be talking about this in one of my Ask Abbie videos soon. But they all have personal stakes in the adventure to go around the world in 80 days. And it's interesting to watch each of their journeys because you know that they each have a different reason for being there. So for Fog, it's kind of about the wager with his frenemy, longtime frenemy, and the fact that he has been like kind of stuck in one place forever. and is tired of being just the same old thing all the time, just like experiencing the same thing day after day.
Has something happened, Fogg?
Nothing's happened. Not for years. I'll start today.
And kind of challenges himself and creates this bet that he can circumnavigate the globe in 80 days. And his friends are like, ha, you can't do that. What a joke. He's like, okay, want to bet? And then creates this wager.
10,000 pounds.
What? 20,000.
With his
Excellent
frenemy
example of an inciting
villain.
incident too. Like,
Yes,
just
such a good example.
the way it was timed, the way it was executed, really
Yeah.
good.
And meanwhile, we have Miss Fix, who is the daughter of one of his friends, and she's trying to kind of break into the publishing world and be taken seriously as a writer.
Worried? I'm not worried. It's just my first credit, that's all. Nothing remotely important.
And she sees this as her first opportunity to really write seriously and have her writing be taken seriously. So she kind of like coerces to get to be part of this trip. And simultaneously we have Passepartout, who is a character who really feels like he doesn't have a place in the world. He's always traveling, always moving on, kind of leaving responsibility behind.
You deserve much more than me. Find a good man. A man who wants to settle down. It's for the best, chérie.
And we see that he really wants to feel like he belongs, and he wants friendship and connection, but he's kind of standoffish and kind of afraid to trust people. And so we see his internal conflict right away, and then we have them all three together on this adventure. We're like, okay, something's going to happen. A lot of stuff happens throughout the course of this story. But what's so interesting that to me really creates a good sense of action and suspense throughout is that there's a ticking clock.
Yes.
Literally. I mean, the introduction is so great too. The intro to the show.
Yeah.
Hans Zimmer and just
Like actual
everything
ticking
else.
clock
It's just-
in the soundtrack.
Yeah.
But you have so
Yeah.
much chemistry. You have actual chemistry between these three characters that you're like, you just can't wait to see the conflicts that are going to arise out of their own internal conflicts, because you can see that they're all ticking time bombs of things that are inevitably going to go wrong, conflicts that will arise, challenges that they'll have to overcome. And it's all going to stem from their internal conflict as a trio.
Yeah, exactly. And we know that they're each going to go on, internal journeys. That's the point, is the internal journeys, not just the external journey, which to me, this is just this series is such a great example of pairing the external journey with the internal journey, because every episode has like kind of character arcs for all three of them,
Right.
which is really fascinating. But some of the action scenes, that's what we're talking about, action scenes. Some of the action scenes are very well executed because it ties the internal conflict into the action itself. So like one of our favorites is the episode where they're in the West of America,
Old
Wild
West.
West. And I love also how each episode has like its own vibe, which is so cool and unique. But in that episode, I feel like I've been rambling too much, so why don't you go into it?
Yeah, in this episode, there's a huge like showdown where they're fighting off the villains, basically, of that episode, the bad guys that have been kind of trying to track them down in this episode, and they have this huge like showdown in the old saloon.
So, if he's going to do this, I just want him to be prepared. Just be prepared.
And there's a ton of action going on, and it's all driven from internal conflict, because the way that they're all reacting to it, you just are on the edge of your seat waiting to see what's going to happen next.
You know what's at stake
Yes,
That's
you know what's at
that's
stake.
kind of the thing. Actually, that's what I meant about like the ticking clock thing. Is like that's like such a important component of the story is like the ticking clock. Like we have to get back to this place at this time on this day.
Right.
And so anything that, you know, we are simultaneously seeing the antagonist kind of trying to slow the mission down,
Right.
so that Fog will fail. And so simultaneously we see that conflict happening, and then every time it's, oh no, we're gonna
a conflict and a challenge that comes up.
Yeah.
We see why it matters to them,
right.
and why this whole journey matters to them. And those two things paired together make it so intense. Every challenge that they face and every conflict that comes up. So when there's an action sequence, you are so rooted in, you're anchored in these three characters, and you understand how they're going to react. You're like waiting to see how they're going to react, and their chemistry together is amazing.
Right.
And so it's kind of almost a form of suspense, anticipation. Right. You're waiting to see, you're like, oh, I think this is what's going to happen.
Right.
Now, if we didn't know that, if we weren't that rooted in these characters and we didn't have that basis, there wouldn't really be much suspense.
Yeah,
and
because there wouldn't be any consequences.
Exactly.
I think the consequence thing is honestly like a huge part of it is like,
yeah, there has to be consequences.
is there a consequence to whatever, if this goes wrong, or if the characters lose or fail, what's going to happen, you know? And if we know what the consequences are, and they're as real and high stakes to us as they are to the characters, suddenly you are way more immersed in the action.
Yeah.
You know? And I feel like that show did a great job of really encapsulating, like, here's the stakes, here's the ticking clock, here are the consequences if we fail.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
And then why it
different.
matters uniquely to
Yes.
each of them, rather than just them all having the same reason.
Right.
They each have a different reason.
Yes.
And it all corresponds together. It's really phenomenal. And so that's a great example of that, those principles that we're talking about working so well in something that's not a big action-packed fantasy or sci-fi. If you're not writing something that's like a Marvel film and you're like, how do I make this action meaningful and feel really intense? It's not so much what's happening on screen, because how many times have you watched some type of like action movie that you're like, oh, I just want to like skip through these sequences? That's not action that's captivating our focus and attention then. So that it's not even the action itself that's making it intense. What makes it intense is when we feel for the characters, and you can do that in any genre. And that's why we picked kind of a plethora of different genres to show you here, because it doesn't have to be some high stakes space adventure in order for us to feel the drama of these action sequences. It's all about feeling for the character and why it matters to them.
And that's honestly why you don't see it as often in those genres, I think, is because a lot of writers rely so much on the genre or the plot or like the world building and the magic, and they rely on that to be entertaining and forget about the fact that you have to capture the audience's curiosity. You have to make them care. You have to engage them emotionally before anything else can matter. Now, magic can be cool, setting can be cool, but it has to come from, there has to be something at the core, you know?
Right. Like we've talked about in a previous episode too, like starting from the lens of the character, like super macro, I think is the right word, and then working your way out. Rather than starting way out here with the universe and the world and the structure and the society and the government and now the character. Like, start us with the character and then work us out from there to the government, the society, and the world and the magic and the universe. And let us experience that through the characters rather than seeing that first.
Yes.
But that's kind of a whole different topic. But there you go.
Yeah,
there you go.
More of a world building tip.
Yeah,
but
we did another episode. I think we did an episode about world building once.
Yeah, we have.
If I can find it, I'll link it below.
But in the vein of
non-committal linking in the description.
Also, I think another thing to address here with action sequences is making it feel like like there's progress being made and there's a choreography involved. It's not just the same thing over and over again. And I know that can be tricky to navigate, but I think there are a lot of examples of it done well that when you notice them, definitely take note of them and pay attention to, okay, what is it about the choreography of this scene that makes me engaged with every moment, right? Everything is slightly different. It's changing, cause and effect. Something's moving forward. It's not just the same thing over and over again, right? You don't have the urge to like fast forward because or skip through paragraphs because it feels like the same thing over and over again. And Kate and I both concur that a great example of this, actually a few examples of this that are really great can be found in the Chronicles of Narnia.
Absolutely, yeah.
Particularly,
good examples of that.
We were thinking of like the first movie, the final battle in the first movie. The choreography of that is fantastic. Also, the choreography of the raid on the castle scene in Prince Caspian is like exactly what I'm talking about here. With like something is unique and special about each scene, each element of it, and there's like that feeling of cause and effect, like there's a choreography to it. I don't even know how to describe it other than that, because it's like every movement matters and it brings you seamlessly to the next movement. But particularly in the final battle scene in the first Narnia film, we have a lot of internal conflicts happening at the same time with our four main characters, the Pevensies, and how they react and respond to what's happening in the battle is really what engages us about it and like pulls us in.
And the thing that's unique about it too, and something super important to remember when writing any action sequence, but especially with fantasy and high fantasy, is the big obtuse fantasy battle. That's like, huge, big scope. We're out in a big environment with lots of people involved, sword fighting and clashing armies. That whole vibe can be this massive scope. We're using a super wide angle lens to get all this. But if we stay at that point where it's really zoomed out, that's what makes us want to skip ahead. Like, okay. When do we get back to the main characters? So we have to anchor. I like to call them anchor points. And in the first Narnia film and book, but we're kind of pulling more from the film here, in the final battle, we're really anchored with Peter and Edmund. And that's really where a lot of the conflict lies, is between the two brothers who have had, not seen eye to eye this whole time. Edmund had the whole betraying everyone for Turkish delight issue, and then Peter was a little angry about it, understandably. And so now Edmund's going to basically, make a big sacrifice on the battlefield to help save Peter's life from the White Witch, who's like turning everyone into statues. So at that moment, that action is so intense. It's the centerpiece of the whole battle, and you can see the way they choreographed up to that moment, that big crescendo of when Peter sees Edmund sacrifice his life to save him. And you feel it in your chest. It's so good. You're like, oh my gosh, this is so intense, so immersive. And the reason why it feels like that is because we've watched this slow buildup with all this goodness, all these different layers between Peter and Edmund, and also their individual respective internal conflict. Why this battle even matters to them personally, not just to Narnia, not just to the world. They understand that aspect of it, but also they have a personal stake in this.
Yes.
They have a personal stake in this, and they understand what that is. And you as the viewer, it just adds, is that frosting on top that just makes it chef's kiss.
It's the character arcs,
yes.
really, It's the character's transformative moment, and it's kind of like the aha moment and the climactic confrontation, like all wrapped up in one. And that oftentimes is such a winning recipe for a really memorable climax, is to encapsulate your character's turning point, their real transformative moment in that ending crescendo, whatever it may be. And it might not be a final battle. It might not be an action sequence or a fight of any kind. It might just be a personal thing for them. And that moment of conflict, like the biggest moment of conflict that this whole thing's been building up to, it wouldn't mean anything if we hadn't had that build up, like you were saying. And so those moments are so important early on to capture and to pay attention to, crafting that conflict as we go along, making it super emotional for the final battle.
Because and like you were saying, even if it's not a battle or a fight, it's really the challenge, the character rising to the challenge, whatever that is, whether it's an enemy or whether it's something within themselves that they've been fighting this whole time to overcome. And actually, all these principles we're talking about, a great example of it in a like kind of way subtle method is the film The King's Speech, which is a perfect example of using all these elements but applying it to someone overcoming a personal challenge in this big moment of internal conflict for them.
Yes.
So you can take all these principles, even if you're like, hey, I'm not writing anything that has like big action sequences like that. You can make that work for your character's internal conflict, rising to the challenge and overcoming the obstacle that stands in their way, even if it's something in their own mind.
Yeah, that's so true. And that's really what's at the heart of every scene that has any level of intensity, that we're kind of on the edge of our seat or there's some sort of suspense. That's really what creates the suspense, is you personally have like an emotional investment in it. You know, it's not just that you care about the characters, it's that you can feel what they feel. I mean, that's the empathy that we want to create between the reader and the character.
Exactly.
And there are many ways that you can do this, for sure, like we've been discussing. But another example, our final example, is another kind of not contemporary, but like historical realistic fiction, which is the series Poldark. Big surprise. We talk about this all the time. I do anyway. I've used it as an example a lot.
Yeah, a lot of you guys have watched it based on a recommendation, which makes me super happy because it's such excellent writing, such excellent storytelling. It nails so many things. So just case study it. Especially the first two seasons.
Yeah, for sure. There's quite a bit of action in the show, but there are a particular like few scenes that to me are like more intense than others. And usually they're not even like the most action-packed, technically speaking.
Right.
One of my favorite fight scenes, I guess, is between our hero character, Ross, and the villain character, George. And they're kind of always at odds throughout the course of the series. There's a lot of conflict between them for myriad reasons. But there comes a point, I think it's in season 2. It's somewhere in like the middle of season 2, where we have this conflict going on between Ross and George because of Ross's cousin, Francis, who is very much involved in his family. And it's kind of like there's been conflicts building up to this point. And Ross has seen how George has like tried to come between the two of them and kind of create this mistrust and kind of sabotage their relationship as cousins and as friends. And Ross has finally come to the point where he's like, he's going to go into business with Francis. They're on good terms.
You're suggesting we go into partnership?
Yes.
And he encounters George, and George sees that, like, oh no, my plan is like being foiled, sort of thing. And he just throws in this dig to really get under Ross's skin and reveals the fact that in the past, Francis once betrayed Ross's trust by revealing some secret aspect of his business, which later helped to destroy his business. And it was all like this master plan that George had going. But he kind of reveals in that scene, like, Francis sold you out, basically. And it's like this pin being pulled out of the grenade moment, where we feel like this intense suspense and like tension in that scene, I think, that is so well crafted. And it's well crafted because we've built up these characters. We've understood their relationships.
I suppose you know where Francis got the money he's investing?
Yes, and we're very much obliged to you, George.
Yes. We paid it him for services rendered in exchange for the names of the Carnmore Copper Company shareholders. £600. Or should I say, 30 pieces of silver.
Both on a personal and professional level. And we understand like what's at stake and why George wants to sabotage Ross and how Ross has these mixed emotions already. And it kind of escalates into this fantastic brawl.
Right.
This great fist fight in the pub, and it's just a well choreographed scene, but it's so intense, not just because it's like, you know, these two characters hate each other and they, you know, start beating each other up. It's way more than that. It's like this build up of their characters.
And there's so many reasons for the hatred, reasons why it's boiled up to this point, and why we understand why that has happened for each of them. It's not just like, oh, they hate each other, so you know
they'll just beat each other up.
This fight is going to happen because like we need it to happen because it's been 10 minutes since the last action sequence. Yes. You know what I mean? So there, and that's what makes us feel it, is to have watched many episodes of this slow build. And also seeing the betrayal moment way earlier and waiting, when is that bomb going to get dropped?
So little for my interest. Why should I care for his?
And you can use suspense. Yeah, you can use that as suspense that will add to your action sequence. When you use suspense to like, when is that going to be revealed? When is that going to just blow up in someone's face and cause this massive conflict that we've been waiting on the edge of our seats to like, oh, when are they going to find out? You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
That's another thing that can make action so much more intense.
Because you're waiting for it.
Yes.
You know, it's like getting the answer to your question. Like, instead of, I always say that about world building, like, don't answer my questions before I ask the question. Like, let me ask the question and then offer the answer, because that creates more curiosity, you know?
Right. And you were talking about this recently on an Ask Abbie too, about like suspense versus surprise.
Yes.
When we're anticipating a conflict versus just, oh, here's a conflict.
Yeah.
It makes it so much more intriguing, so much more submersive when we're like, oh, we know that that's right around the corner. And again, you can use this in more of a laid back story. It doesn't have to be a big fantasy. It can be something that's a contemporary, something that's like, oh, this character knows this secret about this character, and now we're like waiting to see when that's going to be revealed. And
that's my favorite.
Cause some issues, cause some external conflict. It's always internal conflict leading to external conflict, never the other way around. I think that's a good way to remember it, because if you're expecting external conflict to create internal conflict and make the reader care about the characters, it's not going to. What's going to make us care about the action and the external conflict is being rooted in these characters, and we're rooting for these characters. That's what makes us be on the edge of our seat, waiting to see what's going to happen next.
For sure. 100%. So I think we covered a lot in this episode. Just to recap, set up the character's internal conflict first. This is what makes action sequences meaningful, because there has to be that central point of emotion. There has to be that reason we care, because we care about what the characters want and what they're afraid of and what they mistakenly believe is true. You have to create those ingredients before you throw the action-packed plot at them. Anchor us with one or two characters in a big fight scene, and keep the fight intimate, not too broad, not too chaotic. Otherwise, we'd feel more detached from it. We don't care as much. Use internal conflict to make even small action sequences meaningful, such as fistfights or even just verbal arguments. Like, what is really at stake here? What do the characters believe is true? And how have their pasts and past experiences kind of built up to this moment? And remember, of course, last but not least, it's not about what is happening, but who it's happening to. That's what we really care about at the end of the day.
And that's what makes action intense.
Yeah, for sure. So, hopefully you guys took some notes. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. Definitely comment below and tell us what you thought. We love to hear your feedback, and tell us some other great examples of stories that you love that have great action scenes in them, that are character driven, not plot driven, and that really make you care and leave you on the edge of your seat. We'd love to hear about those. So definitely drop those in the comments below. If you haven't seen the video version of this podcast, you can find that at Kate's YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/KAMins. And you can find tons more writing resources on my channel, which is youtube.com/AbbieAmmons. Did you want to give an update about your book? I know it's coming out super soon.
It is. My book, my next book is coming out September 20th. So if you want to check out my website or some info about the launch, be sure to look in the description of the YouTube version of this podcast, because you'll be able to find information about when my book is launching. You'll be the first to know when it does launch. It's also a great time to grab the first book in my series, The Blood Race. If you are unfamiliar with my writing or haven't had a chance to grab any of my books, feel free to do that. You can also get my prequel for free, which is a wonderful way to start the series as well. Abbie has two amazing books out.
Yeah, I have 2 books. One's a sequel to the first one, but I'm working on writing a new one, or editing a new one that's going to be published soon. But in the meantime, if you haven't read 100 Days of Sunlight, go check that out.
So the link will be in the description as well. And Abbie and I are actually co-writing a new series. We're on the cusp of finishing book 2. So if you want to be on the waiting list for that book when it launches, talk about action,
Lots of good action.
meaningful action sequences that will keep you reading till 3 a.m. I think we've succeeded in writing quite a few of those. So if you're someone who likes things that are high stakes, action adventure with like some urban fantasy thrown in, some paranormal aspects thrown in, great relationships, awesome chemistry, just fun action-packed adventure and mystery, sarcastic banter, mine and Abbie's writing, you're going to really enjoy the series. I think it's safe to say you'll enjoy the series. So if you want to get on the waiting list, we just launched a landing page that you can go to, punch your email in, and you'll be notified as we make progress on this book. So if maybe we'll do stuff in the future, like, I don't know, advanced readers.
Oh yeah, for sure. You guys will be the first. You guys will be the first to join the advanced reading list.
Yeah. So if you want to hear updates, if you're like, oh yeah, I'd be interested in that when you guys are ready, then get on that email list, because that's how we would reach out to you guys, and we would love to start inviting you guys to be part of this journey. So check all of that out. Find our books. Best way to support us as writers.
Yes, and if you want to support the podcast and keep it interruption-free, sponsorship-free, go to patreon.com/The Kate and Abbie Show. Thank you guys so much. Thank you all to all the patrons over there who help us keep this show alive and free of interruptions. We love you guys so much. Thank you for listening, and until next time,
stay stoked
and rock on.